everybody.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you all for coming out here tonight. Look at this beautiful crowd of, oh my gosh. My name is Erica, my pronouns are she, her, and I am the events associate here at Books Are Magic. Before we get into tonight's conversation, I did want to go over some housekeeping points for the night. First off, we are kindly asking folks to please keep your mask on at all times during this event, covering both your mouth and your nose. Towards the end of the conversation, we will be doing an audience hand-raised Q&A, so start thinking of some questions to ask now and raise your hand once the time comes. After the conversation tonight, Ernesto will be signing and personalizing books at the back desk near the side door, where you will also be able to exit after tonight's event. We also have additional books available to purchase from my colleague Amali, whom you met at check-in. If you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we highly encourage you to buy a copy of Sacrificio online using the link in the live stream description. Tonight, it is my privilege to introduce Ernesto Mestre-Reed and Helen Phillips, who are here to discuss Ernesto's novel, Sacrificio. Sacrificio is a wildly imaginative story of HIV-positive counter-revolutionaries looking to overthrow the Castro government. Bold, right? Ernesto's writing masterfully captures a country amidst one of its bleakest moments, and at its core lives a group of discarded and triumphant rebels who prove that even with the body beginning to deteriorate, sometimes what it takes is verve and heart. Sacrificio will make you laugh, think, and most importantly, it'll make it very hard for you to turn away from the page. Ernesto Mestre-Reed was born in Guantanamo, Cuba, and lives in New York City. He is the author of the novels The Lazarus Rumba and The Second Death of Única Avellano. He has also translated many novels from Spanish, including Laura Esquivel's Malinche. He is a Guggenheim Fiction Fellow and a MacDowell Fellow and teaches at Brooklyn College. Helen Phillips is the author of 6 books, including the novel The Need, which was longlisted for the National Book Award. She is a recipient of a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship and a Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award. Her novel Hum is forthcoming from Mary Sue Ritchie Books. She is an associate professor at Brooklyn College. Without further delay, everyone please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ernesto and Helen. Are you going to read from the book?
I'll read, is this working? I'll read something very, very quickly, and then
You're going to see all my underlinings.
Into more
it makes
of a
me
conversation.
self-conscious.
So this book is partly based on a series of bombs that went off in Havana in the mid-90s, and it set off sort of the same, the first sort of government protest against the Castro government in a long time. I'm trying to find. Sorry. Well, I'll read from this one. This is a chapter called "The Capacity of Want," and it's one of the main characters. The narrator is sort of going with the woman who does his hair. The main characters in this book were young people in the 90s who, as a form of protest, injected themselves with HIV because there were AIDS sanitariums in Cuba, and they would get 3 meals a day. There would be air conditioning. And the government had set that up, and one of the things that was ironic about it, that it did work. There was less spread of the virus, but because the people inside the sanitariums were having sex with each other, the virus started to transform, and it came back during the early 2000s and affected the population in a way that it didn't affect anywhere else in the world. But this is one of the characters with the woman who does his hair. They're taking a stroll down the main sort of street that goes down to the Malecón in Havana. Fidel Castro does not exist. For a Cuban to say that, wherever she was standing on the face of the earth in the summer of 1997, was like a fish saying water does not exist, or the moon saying the sun does not exist, or the Pope questioning the validity of the Holy Trinity. But that's the first thing that Bertila said when we stepped out of her apartment, and not in a whisper either. She had asked for a moment to change her clothes while I waited for her in the kitchen, and when she came in a few minutes later, I asked her if we were going to a wedding, for she was that transformed. Her dye-stained apron and house dress gone. Now she wore a long, loose black silk top and bright printed blouse. The colorful handkerchief on her head replaced with a shoulder-length red wig, and her fleshy face so delicately made up the paint inventing angles that weren't there before, that she seemed a decade younger. A dainty church lady's purse, her arm just barely squeezed through its straps to the elbow, and a regal dark linen mantle completed the ensemble. This is the way she appeared to Nicolas in his story, I thought. It surprised me that she remained barefoot, but she said that she had stopped destroying shoes with her plowman's feet long ago. This is the way we must behave from here on, she continued, a way of getting ready for the inevitable. And she repeated it, just in case I had not heard her the first time. Fidel Castro does not exist, or will not be very soon. He's as good as dead. But he'll always exist, I said, possibly even more after he dies. Maybe it's better to do all we can to keep him alive, no?
Okay. I have so many questions for you. I feel so close to you, having been reading this book for the past 2 weeks, so close to your brain, and it feels like such a privilege to now be able to actually ask you many of the questions that arose for me when I was reading. And it's also really special to be here because many, many years ago, I think in 2005, Ernesto was my mentor for a tutorial class at Brooklyn College. And I was writing all sorts of wild stuff, and Ernesto, I feel like the best advice you gave me was just keep doing what you're doing. That was what you kept saying.
No, but I remember the one-on-one conferences that I do with students with Helen were the most fascinating because she was the kind of writer who I would tell her, well, why don't you try this? And she goes, no, that's not what I want. That's not what I'm looking for. And I used to come away from those conferences inspired because they're going, all right, you're someone who's not afraid of the madness. And because she was writing these crazy stories, and I was trying to pull her back, and she goes, no, I'm not pulling back.
And your dog. I remember your dog.
Yeah, he died.
Oh, okay.
She died, yeah. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, anyway, it's very fun.
But that's how you can tell sort of a very sort of, and you guys, I mean, a bunch of you here have sort of been my students, but when you get that involved and when you get sort of that committed, but also I think with you is, and your books now show it, is like you were not afraid of the madness. And sometimes you just got to go in there and sort of dig in there, and that's what's fascinating, why I'm so happy to have you here.
Yeah, and I feel like this book goes there all the way in so many ways. And there's so many things I want to talk to you about craft-wise, but I actually want to begin with a question that is, I guess, a little bit more logistical, almost as a way of introducing the audience to the book to some degree. So I thought, as I was reading a lot about the research that you would have done for this book, because, I mean, I don't really like to think of the 90s as history, but I guess it is history now. So what was the research process like, if any, or was there not? I mean, what was that like for you both, sort of, I don't know if that was academic research or personal research or what that?
Or just reading the news research. The article that sort of set the idea for this was published in the New York Times Magazine in the 90s, maybe, like late 80s or early 90s. And it was about men who had injected themselves with HIV. And this is still when the virus would kill you, and had gone into these sanitariums, and a lot of them were married, a lot of them had children, married with women, had children, but were sort of protesting against the government, and a lot of them died. Some of them lived, after the retrovirals came out. But so that was the original source of the story. And then I started doing research, and I started talking to people who lived in Havana in the 90s. And the history is a little changed in the novel because the sanitariums were open from like 1986 to 1994. And it's the only country in the world that did that, that if you were HIV positive, you were put away, and people can come visit you on weekends. But there was so much pressure, so much international pressure from the international community that they closed them down in 1994. And this novel takes place in 97, so the history has changed a little bit. But did reading and then talk to a lot of people who went back and forth to Havana in the 90s.
So you and held on to this idea for this
Oh,
book.
because it was so fascinating the way that and then the articles in the book now, the way that this one man, the New York Times photographer, because this is what American journalists do sometimes. You know, he's set up like this under a waterfall, like he's Saint Sebastian or Christ or something. And it was fascinating. I could not forget it. And the idea back in the early '80s in New York, and the late '80s in New York, that you could purposefully inject yourself with HIV was horrifying.
Well, and that's particularly interesting because there is, towards the end of the book, a journalist character who comes in who proves to be, I think, quite important to the action.
Yeah, and also starts to expose some of the elements that have been secret in the novel throughout.
Yeah. Yes, but also, I mean, I also felt like part of it was a feeling of the distortion caused by the outsider's eye. Like he was trying to tell the truth, but he was getting it wrong.
And even as a Miami Cuban, you can't sort of experience what in a autocratic society, and some of it, you know, we're experiencing ourselves now, but you can't imagine what it's like because it does create a different sense of reality. And so seeing it from the outside, it's almost an impossibility in some ways.
Yeah, and I feel like the book, I think that's a hard sensation to capture, and I really feel that the book captures that as it heads towards the climax. So another thing I wanted to ask you about is the structure of the book, which if you asked me to try to describe it or draw it, or I never could. It's so intricate. It moves around so much in different times. It's really an accomplishment, and I'm so curious how you kept track of that. Like, how did you come to this structure that feels like almost cyclical at times? And
I think I was talking about this with my editor Mark before. I think that I'm very influenced by this one novel called Absalom, the Faulkner novel, which he does that all the time. There's this kind of circular retelling of events, and each time it's retold, it changes somewhat. I think that's the way we live. Like, we live our lives by telling ourselves certain memories, and then when we remember again, something else has happened and something more is revealed about that memory or about ourselves. So I've always been very attracted to that, but it also takes good editors and good readers to say, you know, at the very end of our editing, somebody said something about a fire that takes place at the end, and my editor's like, wait a second, how can he not know this? Like, you said in page such and such that he does know this. Like, oh, okay, we'll change that. So you also need good readers and good editors to sort of figure that out too afterwards.
yeah. As I was reading, I was really like, I don't know how you would keep track of this kind of cyclical. Someone did a good job keeping track of it all. Yeah.
And yeah, it's the readers who give you feedback, but also that at some point the novel wasn't in a state to be published because it needed to be looked at that way.
Yeah, but also it was my writer brain that was like, how would you do this? I could never keep track of this. But as a reader, it made such an absorbing experience of just almost like I was living his nostalgia with him, and then I was in the moment with him, and then that moment recurred. It was so absorbing to be in that kind of non-linear circular time frame. So,
I think
thank you.
and it's almost like something instinctual that I think with writers, it depends on the writers you admire and how they affect you, and that's how you start telling stories. And it's also cultural that Cubans talk all the time and they run around in circles, and they tell stories and retell them, and it's also part of living in a autocratic society where there's a way to tell narratives, and depending on who controls them and how you surrender them.
That's all so interesting to me. You guys, everyone who hasn't read this book should read it. It's so incredible to be inside that structure. It's really quite it just feels like a brain
But when you
experience.
write, but let's say, I think a lot of it, so I tell this to my students too, I think a lot of us do it instinctually, right? That there's a form to create, even in first drafts, like we do something instinctually, and then sometimes it doesn't work, and sometimes, you know, it works so well that you don't even know how you did it.
So did you have an outline for those cycles, the circles?
No,
No.
but I had good readers.
You
But I
had
had
good
good readers who said, like, why is this person talking like this when he should know that
Yeah,
at
yeah.
this point?
Yeah. So I am interested in your choice of the narrator. So Rafa, the narrator, is, I found him a very, in certain ways, a very passive character, where he's really someone witnessing rather than participating. He has his moments, but a lot of it is, how to put it, like a little separate from things, a certain distance. And I was curious about your choice. Was that always the narrator? And what were both the freedoms and limitations of being, because there was, I even found a passage where he's like, I always felt like I was several steps behind everyone else. So how did you come to that as your narrative perspective?
Part of it is, as an immigrant and as somebody who didn't speak the language till I was 9 and being in this country, that's always the way I felt. Like I've always felt like 2 or 3 steps behind in any kind of social situation or intellectual situation. So that part is sort of autobiographical. But part of it is too that he comes from the provinces and he's in the capital and there is a tumult in the capital that hasn't happened in the 40 years of the revolution. So he feels like he's missing something because he hasn't been there. So it's somebody from, anywhere, from Minneapolis or Minnesota coming to New York, and in a difficult period, whatever period we might be facing, now.
Yeah, I thought it was a good point of view. I thought it worked really well. But you could have told it from a more dramatic point of view, but instead he has a certain melancholy to him, a certain nostalgia that is different from the quality of some of the other characters.
And a certain mindset, I think, of being acted upon, which is the mindset of those trying to live in an autocratic system, which sort of dictates almost your daily life from moment to moment. But I also think that there's a scene early on. Have you guys seen The Old Man in the Sea with Spencer Tracy? So you have never seen that, like old movie? Anyway, Spencer Tracy plays the old man. But that movie could not be filmed in Cuban waters because technically Cuban marlin don't jump out of the water. And in Hemingway's novel, they jump out of the water as he's dragging them back. But he wrote it set in this little town in Coimar where the novel opens. But they filmed it off the coast of Colombia because Colombian marlin are very aggressive and they jump out of the water. And so one of the lines is like, they're very passive like all Cubans. And I think that's my perception at least of having to live under an autocracy for a long time where there hasn't been a kind of protest. And partly is that there are some benefits to what's happening, what happened after the revolution to people that were given health care and were given education that didn't have it before. But also that after 60 years of not having certain rights to congregate, or freedom of the press, like there's still a kind of passivity to it. Let's just get from day to day. There's a Cuban term called resolver. Let's figure it out. Let's just get from one day to the other, and then I think I'm partly like that. Like I hate confrontation, so I, if I can just move from one place to another, I'd say let's just get through this little problem. I'm like that with my kids, and then we'll move to the other problem.
Yeah, I feel like you really captured that so much in the book, in many characters. Cecilia, too, has that quality, absolutely.
Yeah, if we get one day to the other, then we'll be fine. We'll figure it out the next day.
So on a very different subject, I want to talk about tattoos and graffiti. Because I feel like this is a book about tattoos and graffiti. I feel like they are the...
I have no tattoos.
There's some good tattoos described in here.
Yes.
That could inspire, could launch 1,000 tattoos.
Yeah, I didn't even, my editor has some great tattoos, but I didn't even know them until...
But I feel like in both cases, tattoos and graffiti are, they're counter-revolutionary, they're a manifestation of art in a place where art isn't really able to flourish in other ways. And so I'm just curious, they really stood out to me. And then the graffiti ends up being very critical to the plot, actually. So what were you thinking about tattoos and graffiti as you were working on this book?
one of the main characters has tattoos. Is it in his fingers or his toes? One of them where it says AIDS, on one hand or one feet, and the other one says saves in English. And he has a tattoo of an American flag in between his two thighs. So it puts them together, you can see the whole flag. But if he spreads them apart, the flag is shattered.
See, there's some good tattoos.
Right. But I'm saying that there's a kind of marking there of taking control of your identity and of your body as yours, and that in itself is a kind of freedom. I don't know if you are all familiar with the Cuban writer Reinaldo Arenas and his famous memoir Before Night Falls, but that's a big theme of that memoir is if you can take control of your own body, whether it be sexually or otherwise, then you kind of liberty that no one can take away from you. And the graffiti is an expression in some ways of that. The graffiti is taking a word that the revolutionary government uses, like we have to sacrifice, and using it as something else. And in some ways, the revolutionary government took it from the Catholic Church, which sacrifice is the central image of the Catholic Church. But I'm fascinated by tattoos, but I'm way too scared to get one.
Yeah, but to think of them both as a way of staking claim of your body, which you don't feel belongs completely to you, or staking claim of a city that you don't feel belongs completely to you.
And also of a kind of sexual power that belongs completely to you and to no one else.
So I mentioned to you before that I thought also of Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities when I was reading this. I don't know how much you were thinking of that, but the evocation of I don't want to have too many spoilers, but I'll just say that there's a society, a very functional society that's kind of squatting on the tops of buildings and connected by these fragile ladders. And for me, in terms of setting, I felt like your hands were on fire when you were writing those sections, but it's the coolest setting that I can imagine. What is that based on a real thing? What are those cities in the air? Tell me everything.
There was this was also in the aughts, in the 2000s. There was an exhibit of Cuban artists in the Brooklyn Museum, and one of them just had these little shacks that, and it was shown in the Brooklyn Museum, these little shacks that were built, and they were no bigger than a couple of those chairs, and that people lived in these shacks on top of buildings. And I've only been to the Caribbean a couple of times, other than Cuba. And one of the things I hated most is driving around the Caribbean and seeing those kinds of things. Like the idea that people can live in a little tin shack while you're on the beach getting drunk or whatever. It just, I don't know. It didn't make me want to go back. But so in a lot of sort of buildings in areas of Havana are completely abandoned, and a lot of people just make their living on top of the buildings because they can get air and they can build their own. But so I expanded that. I sort of invented this city. And I'm fascinated with the idea of cities and how they can incorporate a group and how they can incorporate a dynamic, whether it be political or social.
Yeah, I felt that the society we saw there was the most functional society we saw in the book.
It was like a true socialist, functional, almost like democratic society, as opposed to the one that ran the government.
Yeah, so those pages were exciting, not only visually really interesting, but also they felt liberating to be there.
But I wasn't thinking, although that's an amazing book, and thank you for making that comparison, but I wasn't thinking of that, but it's an amazing book.
I thought of it a lot. So another thing that I'm jumping around a lot, but I just had all these different realms of questions, so I will give myself permission to be random.
No, but it's amazing to have such an intelligent reader read your book, that's all I gotta say.
So another thing that really interested me was the relationship between Cubans and tourists and the Yuma as they're called. And there's one part that says, it basically, I'm paraphrasing, but basically, even if a tourist and a Cuban are wearing the same garment, you can tell which is a Cuban and which is a tourist, because the tourist wears the garment carelessly, and the Cuban wears it as though it's a precious thing. And there are many other really interesting insights throughout the book. So I guess, and then also the foreigners are actually being hired by the Cuban government to spy on the young people of Cuba, which I assume is historically accurate.
Partly, yeah.
Also.
The spy system that Fidel set up, completely baffled the CIA for 40 years. B, no, this is true. Like, he completely outwitted the CIA for 40 years. They spent tons of money trying to kill him. Whether it be they sent an ex-lover of him to poison him with cyanide. Nadia Revuelta. I think there's a movie being made about her now. And she put the cyanide pills in a bottle of hand cream, and she got there. She was going to do it, but Fidel took her back. He was. And she was going to put the cyanide pills, in his drink. But when she went to get it in the bottle of night cream, it had completely dissolved. She's like, I can't use this night cream anymore. But the spy system in Cuba and the way the Cuban intelligence completely outwitted the CIA is, that's a story on into itself. And to this day, and there have been Cubans arrested who worked for the FBI. There was one of the most famous Cuban spies worked for the FBI for like 15 years, and she was sending, information back to Cuba. So it's amazing that, how they did things like that. They would take foreigners and say, hey, you could stay in the island for a couple, hang out for a couple more years. We'll pay you. You got to do, just observe and report. And
I mean, honestly, I finished the book, and I don't understand Stefan, who he was working for. Like, I still don't know where his loyalties were, and there were multiple characters who I felt that way about.
And I think that's the point when we're starting to live in that kind of society ourselves, when truth is not when truth doesn't have a kind of stability, and when there's a force saying, this is what's truth, this is what's truth, this is what's truth, then you start not being sure what reality you're living in. And so I think the relationship between Stefan's like a German tourist, and he picks up the main character, and pays him to have sex with him, and comes back and says he wants to work with him, and then we find out he's been working for the government, but he's not really, he hates the government now. So we don't even know what this character, who this character's loyalties are based on. And I think that's how the Cuban people perceive the Western powers. The Cuban people don't trust the Western powers in some ways, because if someone says we're going to embargo you and not send medicine for 60 years, why would you trust those powers? And why would you trust those powers that have used this little island politically for 60 years? So I think that's the way they're perceived, and he's sort of a representation of Western powers with not always bad intentions, but always screwing things up.
Yeah, and it's interesting, that disorientation that I really experienced as a reader, that was almost a plot disorientation in a good way of like, wait, I don't understand what's motivating people. I don't understand who they're working for. You're giving us just a sip or a drop of that sensation. And
that at some point, these kinds of characters, they may not understand themselves who they're working with.
Yeah, that comes through too. Yeah, Pasquale, who appears at the end, I had the same set of questions about. But we don't need to talk too much about that. That's a secret. So on another very different note, but in honor of the audience here, you teach a beloved novel workshop at Brooklyn College, of which many alums are here. So I'm curious, I've never taught a novel workshop. I always am in awe. I always ask the students, like, how do you do that? How do you read all those novels over the course of the semester? They all love the class. What was it like, or how did it influence or not influence your own, you said a 10-year writing process for this book, to be simultaneously teaching novelists, working with novels? There's a lot of stuff about writing in here, too.
There's a lot of stuff about writing.
There's some really cool...
But this is for you too, Helen. This one doesn't have the acknowledgements. Can I see that one? But this is what I really feel about my students. It's in the acknowledgments after the. Gosh. My students, my scribblers in arms, the world would be a lesser place without your dogged pursuit of beauty and meaning. No, but I really feel that way because I see them working and I see them with a lot less experience than I have. So I have no excuse. I have no excuse. And they also engage me like you engage me. They engage me in thinking about the narrative in a different and a more daring and courageous way.
And so you were teaching again and again the novel workshop while you were working on the book.
Well, I think we've been doing that for a long time, like 15 years, yeah.
I want to read part from the book. Let me see if I can do this with the mic. Just a second. So, when it came down to it, you couldn't tell them apart, the revolutionary and the counter-revolutionary. From Martí to Fidel, they were all one and its opposite, switching places like twins, trying to dupe a straying lover. Again, the book is filled with a lot of just passages like that feel very wise to me, but can you talk at all about that idea of the counter-revolutionary and the revolutionary being one and the same?
So Cuba has had this history with the United States that is completely intertwined and complicated. The book that won the Pulitzer Prize this past year is called Cuba, An American History. And it's fascinating because it begins, from the time that Cuba, asserted its independence from Spain, and there was a revolt, and in the 1890s, and the United States government, said, we're going to, our domain blew up, we're going to come help you. And the Cuban government was basically like, no, we got it. We're going to, but the United States sort of inserted itself into that war so they could sort of plant something in the Constitution that says we have control over your domestic politics from here on. Just like, to this day, Puerto Rico lives in this limbo of not state but territory. They wanted to do the same thing with Cuba. Cuba escaped that, but then, created all these other problems, and so there have been people like Martí and Fidel who go back and forth in this sort of series of revolutions that I think has been part of the history. And somehow it's not been part of our history, but we might be pushing into that territory soon enough.
Erica, am I allowed to keep talking? Yeah.
You got one more question, we're gonna do the next one.
Okay, great. I thought I just wanted to control myself. I have more than one question left, but I'll just do one. So the book switches between English and Spanish, and so I'm curious, was that just a flow thing? Did you ever write something in Spanish and then choose to translate it, or how did that come to be? And as a related question, it's sort of a 2-for-1 because it's my last one. Will this book be published in Spanish?
We're not sure yet, but like I talked to some of us who write with characters sort of existing in another language, and as Fatana said, she used to write. She writes in Russian and translates the Russian into English. I think it's more instinct than anything. But you do get, a lot of American readers don't speak Spanish, so you get questions about how much you want to do it and how to pursue it so that the narrative remains cogent.
I do speak Spanish, but the amount felt very, I don't know, I liked that way it switched.
And not translated. Junot Diaz has a very famous phrase, I don't know if you guys know it, but he says, motherfuckers will read a third of a book in Elvish, but not one in Spanish. But
Fair enough. And maybe it will be translated into Spanish.
Yes,
or
yes.
Yeah.
The first one was. I don't think the second one was yet.
Okay, and it begins. I'll say one last thing. The book begins with an amazing quote from Samuel Beckett that How did you choose that quote? Was that always there with you as you were starting?
It was, because it's about sort of meeting in a garbage, and it's like a prompt from a writing class too. Like, write a love story that begins in a rubbish dump or a garbage dump. And so that's the love story that begins with the two main characters, but it begins in this very hyper dirty place, a politically dirty place.
We met in a rubbish dump. Yeah.
Read it, 'cause I think it's. It's
Should I
so
read the
boy.
whole thing?
It's so beautiful.
Okay,
It's
it's
so
so
beautiful.
beautiful. It's so beautiful. Okay, we'll end with Beckett and then go to question. We met in a rubbish dump, unlike any other, and yet they are all alike rubbish dumps. I don't know what she was doing there. I was limply poking about in the garbage, saying probably, for at that age I must still have been capable of general ideas. This is life. She had no time to lose. I had nothing to lose. I would have made love with a goat to know what love was.
Isn't that like, I would be love with a goat to know what love was.
Okay, so I am accepting questions from the audience, which I will repeat for our internet audience. So if you can say them loud and clear to me, I will then broadcast them loud and clear. I've taught long enough I can sit in this awkward silence for so long, so try me.
I did that last night. Last night I had enough, but I've talked with you about this, but I held it for a long time and it worked.
Yeah, it always does work. It's just, when I was first teaching, I would only give it like 1 or 2 seconds, but now
You must be an amazing teacher.
I have fun. Okay, here we go.
Hi. I was wondering what it was like interviewing Cubans who lived during that time and how it influenced your writing.
I had a couple of good sources. Oh, I'm sorry.
Someone from the audience is wondering what it was like to interview Cubans who lived during that time. What was the second part?
And how it influenced the book.
And how it influenced the book.
I had a couple of people who not only lived there during the 90s and grew up in the 90s, but also went back and forth continually because they still had family there. And they influenced me a lot because it changed a lot of my perspectives, and they read the book and changed some things. It changed a lot of my perspectives of what the city was, and it changed a lot of my perspectives of what that period was like. Because after the Soviet Union fell, this country was supported by Soviet subsidies, and that disappeared. So now they have an American embargo, the absence of Soviet subsidies, the economy collapsed completely. So there was no food, barely food, barely any medicines, and it took like 10 years to come out. In 1998, and this is in the book, the Pope John Paul visited, and that's when it started sort of changing. But there was 8 years of absolute dearth and scarcity. And that's what they talk about in some ways. And some people had power related to the party, so they had more access to more things. It was a really difficult period.
I forgot to mention the Pope visits in the book, which is a very interesting climax. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about research. How much research do you put aside after a while, and when do you decide that I've done enough research, I know what I'm doing, and I need to just trust my instincts and write, even though you might not know everything about what you're about the history of Cuba and the specific time that you're writing about.
Okay, so this is a question about research, and to paraphrase, how you do the balance of doing the research you need to do, but knowing when to set it aside and what the right amount of research is. And I've certainly been in the position of getting overly focused on the research and then not getting distracted from the book itself. So I think that's what you're asking. Is that a correct paraphrase? Okay.
My strategy is to write it and then do the research as you're revising, because I think then it allows you to get some material there that's a lot of it's going to be wrong. Richard Nixon is a character in my new book now, and I've been reading so many biographies and listening to the tapes. this guy was crazy. And have you ever listened to the Watergate tapes?
Yeah.
Holy crap! You know this, and this guy was running our country. I mean, we've had others, obviously, but so yeah, I'm still doing the research, but I'm still writing a character like he's in the at dinner when he was in New York at the top of the World Trade Center with my main character now, and he's talking, and he's probably not talking like he's gonna talk in the last draft, but he's there, so I have to write that scene. So yeah, I usually do it as I'm working on something instead of doing it after, before I get started in writing. But then I know writers like, I saw Edward P. Jones speak once, and he said, I delayed writing The Known World for 10 years because I needed to do this research about African Americans who owned slaves in this period. And I didn't want to do the research, so I delayed writing. And then I just started writing, and I did deal with the history. And no one ever talked about it in any of the reviews. I think that, I would recommend that more than just getting yourself sort of drowned out in research.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. Write the book and then do the research later.
Or as you're
just not
writing
do the
it, as
research.
you're writing
Yeah. Or as you're writing
Like I
it.
have like 3 books on Richard Nixon on my Audible now, and I just sit and listen to it. I know more. I think I know more about Richard Nixon now than almost anybody.
Great. Okay, I saw another.
Which is not a good thing.
Yes, be careful.
So I'm not a writer, but I'm really interested in how you worked with these characters in this book, this story for so long, and what happens after you finish, and where do those characters sit, and where are they with you right now?
So after you finish a book where you've gone so deep with these characters, what does it feel like as you finish the book, and where do they live in you now?
That is a really good question.
That's a really good question.
I don't know. Maybe they transform into other characters. I mean, it's kind of crazy to care about fictional characters. We're sitting in a room mostly full of writers. That's what we do and how we spent our time. But that's a really good question. I mean, I'm sure they're still there to some degree, somehow. They're the youngest characters I've written. They're the most sort of persistently queer characters that I've written. So they have to be there somehow, and you still think about them sometimes, I guess. Do you?
Well,
You just said you were scared to read.
I'm scared to read The Need. Yeah, I think that's such an interesting question, and I always have a real grief as I'm finishing a book, because once I really finish it and really send it off to be published, I can never reread it. I can never revisit it. It's really a closed door for me. I'm frightened of my past books in a certain way. And so I'm really saying goodbye to those characters. So that it really is, it feels a little bit like grief for me.
Okay, now I'm sad.
Maybe they are still alive in you somewhere.
No, I think you're right. I think you're right.
Just
And
once
you
in a
say
while.
goodbye to them in some ways.
As I'm kind
Yeah.
of finishing the last chapter, I've spent so much
sad.
time with you, 4 years or whatever, 10 years,
Yeah.
and it will never be that relationship again. It will never be. So, okay. Anyone else? I felt like I said, yes, go ahead.
Hi, so this book took you 10 years to write, and I just wanted to know, was there any point where you felt like you wanted to stop, or what kept you going?
So
This book took 10 years. Did you ever want to stop, and how did you keep going?
yes, I didn't want to stop. No, and I started other projects after. I had an editor from the second book, and she looked at it. She said, doesn't work. Go your way. And so I started revising it, and then kids get in the way, and you feel like you have no other life for those of us who have kids, because if you're a good parent, you're always there, and other things become less important. But then you go back to it. So yeah, I tell the kids in my novel workshop that writing a novel is like being in a marriage. Sometimes it sucks, but sometimes it's really good, and you keep at it if you value it to a large degree. And there are definitely times where it sucked and you wanted to not, or just to put it away forever. But then there are valuable readers, like an editor will find it and say, wow, I can work with this and I can make it into the best book that I can, which is what I try to do when I teach, is like, let's work with this. It's not perfect now, but we can sort of expand it.
I think I saw a question over there, and then, yeah, okay.
So, hi.
Hi, ma'am.
I barely even know how to ask this, but I wonder just if you got a lot of resistance from different readers along the way, because the kind of like core plot of this, the idea of people injecting themselves with HIV is not something that I feel like a lot of mainstream audiences want to hear about or think about, let alone think about HIV/AIDS at all anymore. So I was just wondering kind of like how was like the reception to that idea as you went along?
So this is a question about the reception or potential resistance to the idea of writing a book that's about HIV, intentional injection of HIV, at a time when people may not want to think about that. And I'm thinking also of your book, Natalie. Yeah, tell us
But
about
I'm sure you have too. Yeah, 'cause I think we all have to some degree. Who are writing serious fiction, saying, "All right, this is too dark, or this is too, this material, is too transgressive in some ways." I think good literature is transgressive, is dark, is disrespectful, and deals with the truth. And this happened, and so you have to sort of deal with it in some ways, in relation to. But I mean, we talk about it in class. You push through it. If you need to write what you have to write, and you need to write as close to truth and beauty as you can, and that should be the only rules.
Go ahead.
You've mentioned a few times kind of the changing political direction of the country, and obviously that was a really dramatic change since 2011, 2012 when you started writing this. Did you feel that affecting the work?
Did the political changes in our country over the course of the past decade, as you were working on the book, affect your thinking about the book?
Yes, I think because it's about insurrection, and it was before the insurrection here happened, but I've always, my kids tell me, can you turn that politics shit off already? Because I have the politics on at 24 hours a day. But because I'm fascinated and obsessed with it, whether it be there or here, because it creates a kind of cauldron for conflict and drama. So yeah, I mean, I'm still revising when Trump was elected, and we know his autocratic tendencies, but I think that's, this is the other end of the political spectrum where that's been happening in Cuba for 60 years, where a government where you can't congregate, you can't vote, you don't have freedom of the press. And now it's happening in Russia, and it's happening in other countries, or it has been happening.
Other questions? Okay, one more question? Okay, one more question. Okay, go ahead.
I was really interested to hear you talk about the ways that you had altered history even while you were doing research. How did you decide, like, which events it was important to be really faithful to and which things you could elaborate on? And did you get, like, pushback from people did anyone want it to be, like, exactly faithful to the history of it?
That's a really good question too. I did get pushback because a lot of people don't know the history, and so it almost seems like unbelievable that anyone would inject themselves with a deadly disease on purpose as a political protest. So I didn't get pushback, and I haven't yet, but I'm sure maybe at some point some critics will. But I think you have to go with what fits the narrative in some ways. For those of us who are writing historical novels, and change it, not so to make a point, but so that it stays true to whatever vision you're trying to play with and explore in the novel.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you
you
all so
everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Ernesto and Helen, for the wonderful conversation. As a reminder, Ernesto will be signing at our back desk. We do just ask that you all wait to approach the back desk. I will be escorting Ernesto back there. You can once again purchase additional copies of Sacrificio at the back desk where you checked in. And for those of us who are still on YouTube, you can find the link to purchase books in the description. That is all for me though, folks. So thanks again everyone for coming out tonight. Join me in giving Ernesto and Helen one more round of applause.